Hey kiddos, so yesterday we got a chance to see what the ancient Mass looks like. What Mass looked like pretty early on, right after Jesus, how it was celebrated. And today we're going to kind of continue on the trajectory to show you how did Mass get from what it used to look like at that time to what we know and have experienced today. So we're going to start following that trajectory. First, I want you to just take a second and think about what did you notice about Mass yesterday? What do you remember about our experience? And from the notes about what the ancient Mass looked like. Again, this is the Mass that was celebrated pretty early on, right after Jesus. So go ahead and jot down a few things that you remember from our experience yesterday. So quickly, as the church is spreading, we see the Mass go from the small section right around Israel, where the early apostles, where Jesus was ministering, and it spreads out up through Greece and then over almost into Italy, following kind of the Greco-Roman Empire. So as the apostles go out, if you remember from the Acts of the Apostles and when we learned about the apostles, quickly after they've established the community, they start spreading out to churches throughout Greater Asia, which is why Paul is writing to those churches of Asia Minor, which is in the modern day Turkey. The church starts spreading along with the Greco-Roman Empire. So because of that, we see formal prayers beginning to develop. Why might it be helpful for formal prayers to develop? Well, the big thing about the formal prayers is that originally you had amazing preachers, charismatic bishops and preachers who felt called by the Spirit and were able to form these beautiful prayers on the spot. And quickly, as the church is getting bigger and bigger and bigger, you don't have the staff at the same level. And so there might be other preachers who maybe don't have that calling and need help writing prayers. That's not their gift or the strength that they bring to that community. Also, it's important to note that as the Mass is becoming part of the Greco-Roman Empire, it's going to be being said in Greek as opposed to Aramaic, because that's going to fit its wider audience. Lucky for us, there are lots of historical pieces out there of people writing about the early Mass. So we're going to get a chance to see kind of what did Mass look like at that time. So if we're going to do that, we're going to look at a piece by Justin Martyr, who's a church theologian, etc. And you're going to open up to OneNote and read the little excerpt by Justin Martyr and then answer the following question. So Mass is going on its way. It fits kind of the same model. The early Greek Mass lasts for quite a while until we get the Protestant Reformation. Bum, bum, bum! And people are fleeing the church, holding the church accountable for abuses that have happened in its ministry and in its application of doctrine. Very valid points that a lot of the reformers are making about the church. And so while they're leaving, the church also then has a response, and it holds the Council of Trent in response in 1570 to try to fix some of the abuses. It's an acknowledgement of the church that they need to make changes because things have gone a bit awry. One of the things that changes during the Council of Trent is the Mass, is the liturgy. There becomes some official changes to the liturgy. We call this Mass that comes out of the Council of Trent the Tridentine Mass, ties from kind of the root of Trent. So two big things that happen to the liturgy at this time are, first, the priest has his back to the congregation. So he's facing away from the congregation and the altar is up against that back wall. Why do we think this might be happening? Well, there's two kind of aspects to this. First, the altar, as I said, is against the back wall. The back wall is to the east. Churches were built oriented to the east, so similar to Muslims praying to Mecca. Churches were built to the east so that they were figuratively facing toward Jerusalem, where the temple used to be. In that similar vein, the priest is facing away from the congregation because the congregation and the priest are all facing in the same direction toward the altar where the sacrifice is being made. The priest is standing in as the one offering the sacrifice for the entire community. So we're all facing the same way, and the priest is merely at the front of the group offering the sacrifice. That is kind of the mentality around this, tying back to the older traditions of sacrifice and altars found at the Jewish temple, etc. Another thing that changed is that the first Roman Missal is created. When I say Roman Missal, that is the book that has all of the prayers and gestures of the Mass. So if you were to open one, you would see that it has exactly what the priest is saying and doing throughout the entire Mass. Why might they be creating one Roman Missal? A lot of the rationale behind this is to create consistency and uniformity and unity across the church. The church is expanded across the whole world at this point. It's very broad and it needs some uniformity. Uniformity also will help crack down on corruption, because then all bishops and priests, etc., are saying the same thing, minus their homilies, etc., at church. So you're getting, hopefully, a crackdown on some of the corruption or deviation from the doctrine and truth. And finally, it's important to note that the language changes again, and the language in the Tridentine Mass is Latin. So they create a uniform language so that all people who go to Mass are listening to Latin. So if you were to go to Mass anytime between here and when the Mass changed, anywhere in the world, the prayers would be the same and you could fit in because you would have learned the Latin. Well, fast forward a couple hundred years to the 1960s, and we get this pretty revolutionary Pope John the 23rd, and he calls for Vatican Council II, which means it's the second council that was held at the Vatican. The big concept around this Vatican Council, which is important to note that this is really the first council called not because there was some big issue that needed to be addressed, but the Pope called it for this idea of aggiornamento, which I probably butchered in Italian, so my apologies. But it means a bringing up to date. Pope John the 23rd wanted to bring the church into the 20th century, wanted to bring the church into conversation with the modern world. What that ends up meaning is that the Mass is going to change. And so now we have Mass as we experience in St. Joe's as a community today. So first, the priest faces the congregation. Why do you think that's happening? Well, a lot of this is changing kind of the model from a sacrificial altar offering back to this idea of the community table fellowship that we experience in the early church. So it's a bringing up to date of the church, but it's also a hearkening back really to the table fellowship that Jesus taught us and Jesus modeled for us in the scripture. Also, we moved from a 1-year reading cycle to a 3-year reading cycle. So originally the church had, as we have the readings at Mass, there was a set of readings for every day, and you would just, every year you would hear the same readings on the same Sunday. So on the 3rd Sunday, it would be the same readings year by year. Now we have a 3-year reading cycle. So on the 3rd Sunday, there's a set A of readings, a set B of readings, and a set C of readings. And if we're on year A, we'd hear the A, B, C, etc. So there's a 3-year reading cycle. Why do you think that that was added? It was mostly added to really help enhance the understanding of the scripture and to really give Catholics a greater access to the scripture, especially because, as commonly referred, Catholics don't read the scripture very often, which is unfortunately true. It's not something that's trained into most catechesis, though luckily you had scripture last year. Woo woo. It's an opportunity to really hear more of the scripture because the fullness of the scripture is important to the faith development. And then finally, the language that we experience in Mass today is called the vernacular, meaning the language of the people. So if the congregation is mostly English speaking, Mass will be in English. If it's mostly Thai speaking, Mass will be in Thai. If it's mostly Spanish speaking, Mass will be in Spanish, etc. There still is opportunity to go to Tridentine Masses. So there are people who really enjoy the Latin Mass, and that's really fruitful for them. And so those are actually still opportunities out there. So while this is the new Mass, it hasn't totally killed the Tridentine Mass. So if you're interested in a Latin Mass, that is a really cool experience to see kind of what Mass was like in my parents' generation and beyond. All right, so I want you to think, we've talked a lot about the differences between Mass at the different levels, but I think it would also be nice for you to spend a few moments thinking about what has been consistent as well as what has differed. So please answer that, and then you are good to go for the day.